October 1847, Wind River Range, Wyoming Territory. I woke to frost on the inside of my teepee walls. Not condensation, frost. Ice crystals that caught the first gray light of dawn and glittered like some cruel joke. The fire pit still held coals from the night before, glowing dull orange beneath a layer of ash. And yet the cold had found its way in and settled across every surface like it owned the place. My breath came out in clouds, thick enough to obscure my hands when I held them in front of my face. The buffalo robe I'd wrapped myself in had kept my core warm enough to survive, but my shoulders ached from how tightly I'd curled against the cold. My feet, even in 2 layers of wool socks inside fur-lined moccasins, had gone numb sometime around midnight. I'd been in the mountains 4 months. August and September had been tolerant, almost generous. Cool nights, sure, but nothing a good fire couldn't handle. I'd congratulated myself on my preparation, on the sturdy teepee I'd traded 3 months' worth of beaver pelts for at Fort Bridger, on my stockpile of firewood cut and stacked before the first snow. I'd felt ready. October taught me the difference between ready and adequate. The canvas teepee I'd purchased was 12 feet in diameter at the base, 14 feet tall at the peak. 15 lodge poles of straight lodgepole pine, lashed at the top with rawhide, spread in a circle, and covered with what the trader had assured me was regulation canvas, same as the Indians use. He'd thrown in a set of wooden stakes to hold the bottom edge to the ground, and called it a fair deal. What he hadn't mentioned, what I hadn't known to ask about, was that the teepee was incomplete. Not defective, not damaged, just incomplete in ways I didn't have the knowledge to recognize. I pushed myself up from the sleeping robes and immediately regretted it. The cold hit different when you moved. It wasn't just temperature, it was presence, weight. The air itself felt heavy with it, pressing against exposed skin like something with intent. The fire pit sat in the center of the teepee, roughly equidistant from all sides. I'd dug it myself, a shallow bowl maybe 6 inches deep and 2 feet across, lined with rocks I'd pulled from the creek bed a 1/4 mile down the mountain. The coals from last night's fire still lived at the bottom. I fed them kindling from the pile I kept dry near my bedroll, then added progressively larger pieces of split pine until flames took hold. The fire grew, heat radiated outward in waves I could feel on my face and hands. I held my palms toward it and felt the sting of warming skin. The smoke rose straight up, drawn toward the opening at the peak of the teepee where the lodge poles crossed. Some of it escaped, most of it actually, but enough lingered at eye level to make me squint, and I had to position myself carefully to avoid the worst of it. The heat felt good for the 3 feet immediately surrounding the fire. Beyond that radius, the cold remained untouched. I could sit close enough to sweat on one side while my back stayed frigid. The temperature gradient was sharp enough to make my body confused about what it was supposed to be doing. I added more wood, larger pieces this time. I was burning through my stockpile faster than I'd calculated. By my estimate, at this rate, I'd need to cut and haul at least 2 cords more before deep winter arrived, maybe 3. The thought of that labor made my back hurt in anticipation. The thing that bothered me most wasn't the cold itself. I'd expected cold. I'd spent winters in Ohio before heading west. I understood what frozen ground and below-zero mornings felt like. What bothered me was the inefficiency, the waste. I was burning good firewood, plenty of it, and the heat was just leaving, escaping through the canvas, rising straight up and out through the smoke hole, disappearing into the mountain air like I hadn't worked 2 hours yesterday splitting and hauling that wood. Through the canvas wall I could hear sounds from the Shoshone camp. They'd arrived 2 weeks after me, maybe 20 families, setting up their winter lodges in a meadow about 200 yards downslope. Close enough to be neighbors, far enough to maintain distance. Their teepees looked similar to mine from the outside. Same conical shape, same lodge poles, same smoke rising from the peaks. But something was different. I couldn't identify what exactly, but I'd noticed it every morning for the past week. Their children played outside at dawn without the desperate hurry of people trying to get back to warmth. Their women emerged from the lodges without the visible bracing against cold that I felt every time I stepped out of mine. Their men stood talking in the early light, not stamping their feet or blowing into their hands, just standing, comfortable. I'd watched Greyhawk's family particularly closely. He was one of the elders, maybe 60 years old, his wife about the same. Their teepee sat closest to mine, maybe 20 yards of open ground between us. Every morning for a week I'd watched them emerge from their lodge without any of the visible suffering I felt. No shivering. No rushing back inside after a few moments. They moved like people who'd slept warm and woke up rested. Meanwhile, I was burning through firewood like a locomotive and still waking up to frost on the inside walls. I'd tried to figure it out through observation. I'd walked past their camp, slowly, trying to see what they were doing differently. The teepees looked the same, the fires looked the same, the wood they burned was the same lodgepole pine I was using, but something was different, something I couldn't see from the outside, something the trader at Fort Bridger either didn't know about or hadn't thought to mention when he sold me the canvas and poles. The frustration sat heavy in my chest, worse than the cold in some ways. I wasn't stupid. I'd built houses before, framed barns, worked as a carpenter's apprentice for 3 years before the fur trade pulled me west. I understood basic construction. I understood how to make a structure sound. But this wasn't about sound construction. This was about something else. Some principle of heat and air and shelter that I didn't have the knowledge to grasp. I fed the fire again, watched the flames catch and grow, felt the momentary warmth on my face, watched the heat rise and disappear through the peak of the teepee, replaced immediately by cold air that seemed to seep in through every seam and stake point at ground level. The wood crackled and popped. The smoke made my eyes water. My hands finally stopped aching from the cold. But my back stayed frigid, and I knew that as soon as I moved away from the immediate radius of the flames, the cold would reclaim every inch of space I'd temporarily warmed. This was going to be a long winter. The trader at Fort Bridger had been a man named Morrison, thick-built and confident in the way of people who made their living selling things to people who didn't know better. He'd laid out the teepee poles and canvas on the packed dirt outside the trading post and walked me through the basic setup like he was doing me a favor. 15 poles, he'd said, pointing to the bundle of lodgepole pine, each one maybe 18 feet long and smooth from having the bark stripped. You set 3 for the tripod first, lash 'em at the top with rawhide, then lean the other 12 around them in a circle, canvas wraps around the outside, stakes to hold the bottom, and you're set. Indians have been living in these things for hundreds of years. I'd asked about the smoke hole at the top. Morrison had shown me the 2 flaps of canvas, each attached to a pole that extended above the peak of the tipi. Winds blowing from the north. You angle these flaps north to create a draw, he'd explained. Wind shifts, you shift the flaps, pulls the smoke right out. I'd asked about insulation. Buffalo hide's better than canvas, Morrison had admitted, but hide's expensive and hard to come by unless you kill the buffalo yourself. Canvas works fine, weather tight, sheds rain, keeps the wind off. I'd asked about the floor. Dirt's fine, Morrison had said. Some folks lay down pine boughs or hides for padding. Up to you. What Morrison had not mentioned, what he either didn't know or didn't think to include, was that a functional tipi required more than poles and canvas, required elements I had no names for and couldn't have asked about even if I'd known they existed. The liner was the first thing I'd missed. I didn't know this yet, standing in that October cold watching my breath freeze, but the liner was the element that separated a canvas funnel from actual shelter. The throat, those adjustable flaps at the peak, I had, but I didn't understand how to use them. Morrison had made it sound simple. Wind from the north, angle north. But he hadn't explained what happened when the wind shifted at midnight, or how to prevent downdrafts, or how to balance draw against heat loss. The fire pit I'd dug myself, but I'd dug it wrong. Too shallow, too centered. Without thermal mass beyond the ring of rocks that served more as a boundary than as heat storage. These weren't defects in the teepee. They were gaps in knowledge. The trader had sold me the visible parts of the structure and assumed that was enough. Or maybe he'd just sold what he had and didn't care whether it was enough. I spent the first 3 weeks of October learning exactly how not enough it was. The canvas walls, which looked solid and weather-tight, turned out to be excellent conductors. Heat from the fire radiated outward, hit the canvas, and passed right through to the outside air. The fabric itself provided almost no insulation. It kept the wind off, mostly, but it didn't trap. Warmth. At ground level, where I'd staked the canvas to the earth, cold air seeped in continuously, not through holes, not through tiers, just through the fundamental reality that cold air is denser than warm air and flows like water toward any low point it can find. The stake points provided plenty of access. So did the doorway, which I'd fashioned from a canvas flap that never quite sealed against the frame. The smoke hole at the peak, necessary for venting, functioned exactly as designed. It let smoke out. It also let heat out. All of it. Every thermal unit produced by burning wood rose on convection and exited through that opening. What remained in the teepee was whatever heat happened to be radiating horizontally at any given moment, and that radius extended maybe 3 feet from the flames. I tried adjusting the throat flaps to reduce the opening. Less smoke escaped, but so did less heat, and instead of solving the problem, I just created a new one, smoke accumulation at eye level. I'd wake up coughing, throat raw, eyes streaming. I tried banking the fire at night, covering the coals with ash to make them last longer. This worked in theory. The coals stayed alive until morning, but banked coals produce minimal heat, and without active flames, the teepee temperature dropped to within a few degrees of outside air by midnight. I tried burning more wood, feeding the fire constantly, keeping active flames going through the night. This kept the immediate area around the fire tolerably warm, but I burned through wood at an unsustainable rate, and even with constant feeding, the far side of the teepee stayed cold enough to freeze water. The problem wasn't effort. I was willing to work. The problem was physics, though I didn't have that word for it yet. The problem was that I'd built a structure that fought against the fundamental behavior of heat and air, and no amount of firewood was going to overcome that. By the 3rd week of October, I'd fallen into a routine of misery. Wake up cold, build up the fire, warm the front of my body while my back stayed frozen, burn through an armload of wood, watch the heat disappear up through the smoke hole, add more wood, repeat. My hands developed calluses on top of calluses from splitting logs. My back ached constantly from hauling wood up from the tree line. My throat stayed raw from breathing smoke. My sleep was shallow and interrupted, broken by cold every time the fire burned low. And every morning I'd watch the Shoshone families emerge from their lodges looking comfortable and rested, and the gap between their experience and mine felt like an accusation. I considered approaching them to ask for help. Pride stopped me initially. I was a grown man, a carpenter by training, someone who should be capable of figuring out basic shelter. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat. But more than pride, it was the language barrier. I spoke maybe 20 words of Shoshone, learned from brief trading encounters at the fort. They spoke limited English, and what they did speak, they didn't seem inclined to waste on a white trapper who'd set up camp in their valley without asking permission. So I kept to myself, splitting wood and feeding fires, and trying to understand through observation what I was missing. Greyhawk's teepee sat close enough that I could hear sounds from inside it sometimes. Voices in the evening, laughter occasionally, the normal sounds of a family living comfortably in a structure that worked the way it was supposed to work. His wife, I never learned her name, tended their fire morning and evening, but I noticed she didn't feed it constantly. She'd add wood in the morning, then again in the evening, but not with the desperate frequency I was maintaining. Whatever heat their fire produced, it was lasting longer, spreading farther, working more efficiently than mine. I tried to see inside their teepee through the doorway when I walked past, but the angle was wrong, and the door flap stayed closed most of the time. All I could glimpse was the general interior space, which looked similar to mine: fire pit in the center, sleeping robes around the edges, belongings stored along the walls. But something was different, some element I couldn't identify from outside. The trader had sold me a teepee, but what the Shoshone families had were homes. The difference between those two things was a gap I didn't know how to cross. I added another log to my fire, watched it catch, felt the brief wash of warmth, watched the heat rise and disappear. This was going to be a very long winter. Greyhawk watched me for 3 days before he said anything. I didn't notice it at first. He was just there, sitting outside his teepee in the early morning, working on what looked like a piece of leather, scraping it with a stone tool, his movements patient and methodical. I'd nod when I walked past on my way to cut wood. He'd nod back. That was the extent of our interaction. But on the third morning, I realized he wasn't working on the leather. He was watching me. The scraping was something his hands did, while his attention focused on my routine, emerging from the teepee with visible shivers, immediately gathering kindling, building up the fire that had died during the night, feeding it until flames rose high enough to drive back the cold. He watched me burn through an armload of wood in the first hour of daylight, watched me add more, watched me position myself as close to the flames as I could stand, turning periodically to warm different sides. On the fourth morning, he stood up when I emerged from my teepee and walked toward me without preamble. His pace was unhurried, the gait of someone who'd lived in these mountains for decades and had no reason to rush. He wore a leather shirt decorated with quill work, leggings, and moccasins that looked substantially warmer than mine. He stopped about 10 feet from my fire pit and spoke in Shoshone. I caught maybe one word in 5, something about cold, something about fire. His tone wasn't mocking, just observational, the way you might comment on weather or the quality of game. I shook my head, gestured to indicate I didn't understand. He switched to English, heavily accented but clear enough. "You cold?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said, no point denying what was obvious. He walked closer, circling my teepee slowly, studying it the way I'd seen him study animal tracks, carefully, looking for information in details I couldn't see. He stopped at the doorway, lifted the canvas flap, peered inside. Let the flap drop, continued his circuit. When he reached the windward side, he knelt and lifted the bottom edge of the canvas where I'd staked it to the ground, held his hand there, palm facing inward, nodded slowly like something had been confirmed. He stood and walked back to where I stood by the fire, gestured for me to follow him to the edge of my teepee. I did. He knelt again, lifted the canvas edge, and put my hand where his had been. I felt it immediately. Airflow, cold air, moving with purpose, flowing under the canvas edge and into the teepee. Not a draft from wind, just the steady movement of dense, cold air seeking lower ground, finding the gap at the stake line, and pouring in. Greyhawk said something in Shoshone, then added in English, "Cold comes here." He moved his hand in a gesture that indicated flow, water-like, entering at ground level. He stood and pointed to the smoke hole at the peak, made a rising gesture with his hand. "Hot goes there." I understood. Cold air in at the bottom, hot air out at the top. My teepee was functioning as a chimney, with me sitting in the middle of the draft. But I didn't know how to fix it. I said as much, using hand gestures to supplement my limited words. Greyhawk studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he made a decision that I would spend the rest of my life being grateful for. He walked to his own teepee, lifted the door flap, and gestured for me to follow. The difference hit me as soon as I stepped inside. Warmth. Not the intense, radiant heat of standing directly next to a fire, but ambient warmth that filled the entire space evenly. The kind of warmth that made my shoulders relax without me realizing they'd been tensed. The fire in Greyhawk's pit burned low, barely more than coals with a few small flames. Nothing like the roaring fire I maintained. And yet the interior of his teepee felt 20 degrees warmer than mine. I looked around, trying to understand what I was seeing. The layout looked similar to mine. Circular interior, fire pit in the center, sleeping robes arranged around the edges. But there were differences that became apparent once I knew to look for them. The first thing I noticed was a second wall. Interior to the main canvas covering, suspended from the lodge poles, hung what looked like another layer of hide or canvas. It didn't reach all the way to the ground. It stopped about 2 feet up, creating a gap at the bottom, and extended up to roughly head height when sitting. Greyhawk walked to the inner wall and lifted it slightly, showing me the gap between it and the outer canvas wall. He put his hand in the gap, then gestured for me to do the same. Air, moving air, warmer than the outside, cooler than the interior, flowing upward in the space between the two walls. He pointed to the gap at the bottom where the liner didn't reach the ground, made a gesture of air flowing in, then traced the path up between the two walls, then pointed to the top where the liner ended, showing how the air entered the main living space. I started to understand. Cold air was still entering at ground level, but instead of flowing directly into the living space, it was channeled into the gap between the two walls. As it rose in that gap, it warmed from contact with the heated inner wall. By the time it entered the living space at head height, it had lost its bite. Meanwhile, the inner wall itself acted as a radiant barrier. Heat from the fire couldn't escape directly through the outer canvas. It had to warm the inner liner first, and that liner radiated warmth back into the living space instead of conducting it outside. It was simple, elegant, obvious once I saw it, and completely invisible from the outside. Greyhawk pointed to the fire pit, then walked me through the second difference. His pit was deeper than mine, maybe 10 inches instead of my shallow 6, and it was positioned not in the exact center of the tipi, but offset slightly, toward the rear. He knelt by the pit and gestured to show rising heat. The heat rose, but because the fire was positioned toward the back, it had to travel through more of the living space before reaching the smoke hole. More distance meant more time for heat to radiate into the room. The stones lining his pit were larger than mine, some of them fist-sized or bigger. He touched one, hot enough that he pulled his hand back quickly, and then made a gesture of the stone holding heat, letting it out slowly over time. Thermal mass. The word wouldn't come to me for another few months, but that's what he was showing me. The stones absorbed heat during active burning and released it gradually for hours afterward. The third difference took me longer to spot. The throat flaps at the peak. I had them too, but Greyhawks were positioned differently. Instead of leaving the smoke hole fully open, he'd angled the flaps to create a smaller opening, offset from center. The smoke still escaped, drawn up by the natural draft, but less heat escaped with it. When wind shifted, the flaps acted as a baffle, preventing downdrafts while maintaining draw. It was a balance I'd been unable to achieve in my own teepee, enough opening to vent smoke, not so much that heat poured out uselessly. Greyhawk walked me back outside and pointed to my teepee, then to his, then made a series of gestures that I interpreted as an offer to help. My pride had died somewhere around the second week of waking up to frost on the inside walls. I nodded. Yes, please. He said something in Shoshone to his wife, who'd been watching from the doorway. She disappeared inside, then emerged with what looked like several large pieces of hide and canvas, already cut and ready. They'd known. They'd been watching me freeze for weeks, and they'd already prepared the materials I'd need. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or embarrassed. I settled for both. Greyhawk's wife, I later learned her name was Catches Early Light, though I never learned if that was translation or approximation, spread the hide pieces on the ground outside my teepee and showed me what she'd sewn, not with words. Her English was more limited than her husband's, but with patient gestures and by letting me examine the pieces themselves. The liner was in sections, 3 large pieces of elk hide, already treated and softened, sewn together along the edges with sinew. The combined piece formed a rough circle when laid flat, maybe 15 feet in diameter, with attachment points along the upper edge where leather thongs had been fixed. She demonstrated by holding up one edge and making a hanging gesture, pointing to my lodge poles. The liner was meant to be suspended from the poles interior to the outer canvas, creating that double wall effect I'd seen in Greyhawk's teepee. I'd expected this to be a simple installation. Hang the liner, stake it at the bottom, done. But Catch's Early Light stopped me before I started, shaking her head firmly when I reached for the bottom edge. She made a clear gesture. The liner did not touch the ground. 2 feet of gap needed to remain between the liner's bottom edge and the earth. I didn't understand why at first. Leaving a gap seemed counterintuitive. Wouldn't cold air just flow in underneath? Wasn't the whole point to seal out the cold? Greyhawk had followed us over from his teepee. He knelt at the base of my canvas wall and again demonstrated the cold air flow, dense air pooling at ground level, seeking entry. Then he stood and made a rising gesture with both hands, from ground to chest height. He pointed to the gap beneath the liner, then traced the path of air flowing into that gap, up between the liner and outer wall, and eventually entering the living space at head height. The principle started to clarify. You couldn't stop cold air from entering. It was going to come in no matter what you did. The question was where you directed it and what happened to it on the way. By channeling the incoming cold air into the gap between the walls, you accomplished 2 things. First, the air warmed as it rose, heated by contact with the liner. Second, you prevented it from flowing directly across the floor of the living space where people slept. Without the liner, cold air entered at ground level and immediately spread across the floor, settling in a layer that no amount of fire seemed able to overcome. I'd been sleeping with cold air literally flowing beneath and around my bedroll all month. With the liner, that same cold air entered at ground level, but was directed upward in the wall gap. By the time it reached breathing height, it had lost enough of its bite to be tolerable. The installation took most of the morning. First, I had to remove everything from inside the teepee: sleeping robes, provisions, firewood, everything. Then Greyhawk helped me position the liner, attaching the leather thongs to the lodge poles at intervals, making sure the whole thing hung evenly and maintained proper spacing from the outer wall. The gap between the liner and outer canvas needed to be consistent, roughly 6 inches all the way around. Too narrow and air couldn't flow properly. Too wide, and the insulation effect diminished. Catch's Early Light checked our work at multiple points, making small adjustments, ensuring the bottom edge of the liner hung at the correct height. When she was satisfied, she nodded. The liner transformed the interior space immediately, even before I relit the fire. The atmosphere felt different, quieter somehow. The canvas had always transmitted sound from outside: wind, voices, animal movement. The liner dampened that. More than dampened, it created a sense of enclosure that the single wall had never provided. Greyhawk gestured for me to wait before relighting the fire. He wanted to address the fire pit next. What I'd dug was adequate for holding a fire, but inadequate for storing heat. He showed me this by placing his hand on one of my small rocks, cool to the touch, even hours after a fire had burned. The rocks needed to be larger, he indicated, much larger. We spent the next 2 hours at the creek bed selecting stones. Greyhawk was particular about what he chose. He wanted dense, heavy rocks, not the lighter, porous ones. He demonstrated by striking two rocks together. The dense ones rang with a clear tone, while porous stones gave a dull thunk. The dense stones held heat better, he explained through gesture. They took longer to warm up, but once hot, they stayed hot for hours. We carried 9 large stones back to my teepee, each one requiring 2 hands to lift. Greyhawk had me deepen the fire pit another 4 inches, hard work in ground that was starting to freeze, and then we positioned the stones in a ring around the edge of the pit. The final stone went in the center, flat side up, creating a surface that would absorb maximum heat from coals placed directly on it. Greyhawk then did something I hadn't expected. He moved the entire pit, not by much, maybe 8 inches toward the rear of the teepee, but he was specific about the position. He used a stick to mark where the center of the pit should be, relative to the door and the slope of the teepee walls. The repositioning meant that when I sat facing the door, the fire was slightly behind center rather than exactly centered. This seemed wrong to my sense of symmetry, but Greyhawk was insistent. He explained by making rising gestures again. Heat rises straight up. If the fire is exactly centered beneath the smoke hole, the heat takes the shortest path out. If the fire is offset, the heat has to travel farther, spending more time in the living space before escaping. It was the same principle as the liner. You couldn't prevent heat from escaping, but you could control its path and maximize the time it spent where you needed it. With the pit deepened, repositioned, and lined with proper stones, Greyhawk finally indicated I could build a fire. I built it the way I'd been building fires all month, kindling at the bottom, progressively larger pieces arranged in a loose stack, encouraging airflow and flame development. Greyhawk stopped me halfway through. He rearranged my wood pile, creating a tighter structure with less air gap. He indicated that once the fire was established, I should bank it this way, dense and compact, burning slowly rather than hot and fast. The goal wasn't maximum flame, it was sustained heat over time. I lit the fire, the kindling caught, the flames grew, smoke rose toward the smoke hole, drawn up by natural convection. But something was already different. The heat wasn't immediately disappearing, it was spreading outward, radiating against the liner, warming the air in the main living space, instead of just creating a hot zone directly around the flames. Greyhawk made adjustments to the throat flaps outside, positioning them based on the current wind direction. I'd been leaving mine in a fixed position, adjusting them only when smoke became unbearable. He showed me they needed constant attention, small shifts throughout the day as wind changed. The flaps weren't just for drawing smoke out, they were for controlling the rate of air exchange. Open them too wide and you pulled smoke efficiently, but also pulled all your heat. Close them too much, and smoke accumulated. The balance point was narrow and shifted with conditions. We sat in the teepee as the fire established itself. The temperature rose steadily. Not dramatically, this wasn't the intense, radiant heat of my previous approach, but it was even, consistent. The warmth spread to the edges of the space instead of creating a 3-foot radius around the flames. The liner began to radiate heat back into the room. You could feel it if you held your hand near the hide, warmth coming off the surface. Secondary. Radiation from heat that had been absorbed and was now being released. After an hour, Greyhawk touched one of the stones lining the fire pit. Hot. He indicated with gestures that this heat would last. The stones would continue radiating warmth for hours after the flames died down. This was the system, not one element, but 3 working together. The liner directed cold air and retained radiated heat. The fire pit, deeper and lined with thermal mass, stored heat for extended release. The throat flaps controlled the rate of air exchange, balancing smoke removal against heat retention. Each element on its own would have helped. Together, they transformed the teepee from a canvas funnel into actual shelter. Greyhawk stood to leave. Before he did, he said something in Shoshone, then repeated it in English. "Fire works for you now. Before, you work for fire." He was right. I'd been feeding fire constantly, desperately, burning through wood to produce heat that immediately escaped. Now the fire would work the way it was supposed to, burning less wood but producing more usable warmth because the structure was designed to retain and distribute what it created. He left me there, sitting in a space that was steadily growing warm, and I understood that what he'd given me wasn't a trick or a hack. It was knowledge. The accumulated understanding of people who'd been living in these mountains for longer than my culture had been on this continent. The trader at Fort Bridger had sold me a Tipi. Greyhawk had taught me how to live in one. The first night, with the liner installed, I made the mistake of building the fire too large. Old habits. I'd spent 4 weeks learning that more fire meant more heat, so when the temperature dropped after sunset, I fed the flames until they rose a foot above the pit. The teepee became uncomfortably hot within 20 minutes. Sweat soaked through my shirt. I had to remove my outer layer and still felt like I was sitting in an oven. The problem was obvious once I experienced it. The liner was doing its job too well. With the double wall insulation retaining heat instead of letting it bleed through the canvas, even a moderate fire produced more warmth than the space could handle. I let the fire die down to coals. The temperature stabilized at something between warm and hot. Comfortable once I stopped trying to replicate my previous approach. That stabilization was the first lesson the liner taught me. Heat retention meant I didn't need constant high flames. I needed sustained coals and thermal mass. The stones in the fire pit held temperature long after visible fire disappeared. The liner trapped and redistributed that stored heat throughout the night. I slept without waking for the first time in a month. Morning revealed the second aspect of how the system worked. I'd expected to wake up to the same kind of cold I'd been fighting, fire dead, temperature dropped, frost forming. Instead, I woke to a space that was merely cool. Not warm exactly, but far from the bitter cold I'd become accustomed to. The stones in the fire pit were still releasing heat. Not much, but enough to take the edge off the dawn temperature. The liner had held enough warmth overnight that the interior space hadn't equalized with outside air. I built up the fire from the coals that remained, still alive under their layer of ash, still capable of catching kindling without needing to start from scratch. The tipi warmed quickly, much faster than it had with the single-wall design. But I noticed something else as the fire grew. Smoke was accumulating at eye level, creating a hazy layer that made my eyes water. I'd angled the throat flaps the way Greyhawk had shown me the previous day, but something was wrong. The draw wasn't working. I went outside to check the flaps. Wind direction had shifted during the night. What had been correct positioning yesterday was now creating a downdraft, pushing smoke back into the teepee instead of drawing it out. I adjusted the flaps, angling them to account for the new wind direction. The smoke layer inside began to clear almost immediately. The draw improved, pulling smoke up and out while maintaining enough restriction to prevent excessive heat loss. This was going to be the ongoing challenge, constant small adjustments based on changing conditions, wind direction, temperature, barometric pressure, all of it affecting how air moved through the structure. Greyhawk had made it look effortless, but I was learning it required attention, not constant attention, but regular awareness of conditions and willingness to make frequent small corrections. Over the next few days, I developed a routine with the liner that felt less like fighting against physics and more like working with it. Morning fire built from overnight coals. Moderate flames, not excessive. Throat flaps adjusted based on wind. Fire allowed to burn down to hot coals by midday. Small additions of wood to maintain coal bed. Larger feeding in evening to carry warmth through the night. The wood consumption dropped dramatically. I was burning perhaps a third of what I'd been using before. The same amount of fuel produced substantially more usable heat because the structure was designed to capture and hold it rather than vent it directly outside. But the liner required maintenance I hadn't anticipated. The hide was porous enough to breathe, a feature, not a defect. But that porosity meant it accumulated moisture from cooking, from breathing, from the general humidity produced by living in an enclosed space. Every few days, I needed to loosen the liner from its attachment points and take it outside to air. Otherwise, moisture would accumulate in the material, creating weight and potentially leading to mildew. Greyhawk had shown me this on the third day, how to quickly detach the liner, carry it outside, drape it over a support to dry in sun and wind, then reinstall it. The process took maybe an hour, and it meant maintaining a second temporary fire outside while the liner dried. Inconvenient, but necessary. The liner was doing hard work, regulating airflow, retaining heat, creating a barrier against cold. It needed care to continue functioning. I also learned that the gap between liner and outer wall required monitoring. Too much debris, pine needles, dust, small bits of bark from firewood would accumulate in that gap and restrict airflow. Every week or so, I needed to lift the liner and sweep out the accumulated material. These maintenance tasks were the price of having a functioning shelter. The single wall design had required no maintenance beyond patching holes, but it also hadn't worked. The liner required regular attention, but it delivered warmth and efficiency that made that attention worthwhile. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping through nights without waking. My wood consumption had stabilized at a sustainable level. The space felt like shelter rather than a temporary structure I was fighting against. I watched Catch's early light work outside her teepee one morning and noticed something I'd missed before. She wasn't just maintaining their liner, she was making small adjustments to how it hung, loosening one section slightly, tightening another, creating subtle variations in the air gap that affected how air flowed in the space between walls. I tried to replicate what I'd seen, making small adjustments to my own liner. The effect was immediate and noticeable. A section that had been warmer than the rest equalized. A cold spot near the doorway became less pronounced. The liner wasn't a static installation. It was a dynamic system that required ongoing tuning based on conditions and observations about how heat and air moved through the specific space. This was knowledge that couldn't be conveyed through simple demonstration. It had to be learned through use, through paying attention to how the space felt, through making adjustments and observing results. Greyhawk stopped by that afternoon, poked his head in to check on my setup, nodded approval at the adjustments I'd made. He said something in Shoshone I didn't understand, but the tone was approving. His wife brought over a bundle of dried sage and showed me how to occasionally burn a small amount in the fire pit. The smoke carried a sharp, clean scent that replaced the stale smell that had been accumulating. But more than that, she indicated through gesture that the sage smoke helped regulate moisture in the liner itself, keeping the hide flexible and preventing that accumulated dampness. I was learning that living in a Tipi with a functional liner system wasn't about setting it up once and forgetting it. It was about ongoing relationship with the structure, constant small acts of maintenance and adjustment that kept the system working properly. The trader had sold me canvas and poles. What I was learning from Greyhawk and Catch's early light was how to live in the mountains, how to create shelter that worked with the environment rather than simply existing in it, how to pay attention to materials and air and heat and make the small adjustments that added up to comfort and efficiency. By the second week, I stopped thinking about the liner as an addition to the tipi and started thinking about it as fundamental to what a tipi actually was. The single wall design I'd started with wasn't a complete tipi, it was a framework missing its essential element. The liner was the element that made the structure functional. Without it, I'd been living in a canvas tent that happened to be shaped like a tipi. With it, I had an actual dwelling designed specifically for mountain winters. The knowledge felt heavy with implication. How many other white trappers and settlers were freezing in inadequate shelters because traders had sold them incomplete structures? How much suffering and wasted effort came from not knowing what elements were actually necessary? I thought about Morrison at Fort Bridger, confidently explaining Tipi setup without mentioning the liner, and wondered if he'd known how incomplete his information was, or if he, like me, had simply never seen the interior of a properly constructed lodge and didn't know what he didn't know. That night, the temperature dropped to 15 below zero. Wind came screaming down from the peaks, hitting the valley with force that made the teepee poles creak. I lay in my sleeping robes, warm enough to be comfortable, listening to wind that would have made my first month in the mountains unbearable. The liner held. The fire pit radiated stored heat through the darkness. The throat flaps, properly adjusted, vented smoke without venting warmth. Outside, I could hear ice forming on the creek. Inside, I was warm enough to sleep. The difference between those two states was knowledge. Specific, earned knowledge about how heat moves, how air flows, how materials behave. Knowledge that had been developed over generations by people who had to understand these principles or die. Greyhawk had given me that knowledge freely. He and Catch's early light had spent days teaching someone who'd arrived in their valley without permission, who represented a culture that was actively displacing their way of life, who had nothing to offer them in return. I didn't understand why they'd helped. Maybe they'd grown tired of watching me struggle. Maybe they'd seen too many white men freeze in inadequate shelters and decided one more death was unnecessary. Maybe they believed knowledge should be shared, even with people who didn't deserve it. I didn't know. But lying there in warmth that wouldn't have existed without their teaching, I understood that what they'd given me was more valuable than anything Morrison had sold me at the fort. The liner breathed, heat stayed, cold remained outside where it belonged. For the first time since arriving in the Wind River Range, I felt like I might actually survive the winter. The throat flaps defeated me for 2 weeks before I understood them. I'd watched Greyhawk adjust his throat flaps dozens of times, small movements throughout the day, responding to shifts in wind that I couldn't yet feel. It looked simple. 2 poles extending above the tippy peak, each attached to a canvas flap that could be angled to open or close the smoke hole. Point them into the wind to create draw, away from the wind to prevent downdraft. Simple in principle, maddeningly complex in practice. The first problem was that wind in the mountains didn't blow from consistent directions. Back in Ohio, wind patterns were predictable, prevailing westerlies most of the year, occasional shifts from the north or south. You could set a chimney cap and leave it. Mountain wind had personality and malice. It would blow from the northwest at dawn, shift to straight north by mid-morning, swing around to the northeast by afternoon. It would funnel down valleys, bounce off ridges, create eddies and swirls that changed direction every 100 yards. The throat flaps had to respond to these changes, or the teepee became unlivable. Point them wrong, and smoke would back down into the living space within minutes, driven by downdraft that overwhelmed the natural convection, trying to pull smoke upward. I'd wake up coughing, eyes streaming, stumble outside to adjust the flaps, get them positioned, go back inside. 20 minutes later, the wind would shift, and I'd be coughing again. Greyhawk stopped by one morning after I'd been outside 3 times in an hour, adjusting and readjusting. He watched me struggle with the poles for a moment, then shook his head. He didn't explain with words. Instead, he had me sit inside the teepee while he went outside and made adjustments. Each time he moved the flaps, he called out for me to observe what happened to the smoke inside. Position 1. Smoke rose cleanly through the hole, but I could feel cold air being pulled down from the opening. The draw was too strong, creating negative pressure that sucked heat out, along with smoke. Position 2. Smoke lingered at eye level, accumulating in a hazy layer. The opening was too restricted. Position 3. Smoke rose steadily, no accumulation, and the cold air pull was minimal. This was the balance point. He had me come outside and look at how he'd positioned the flaps. They weren't pointed directly into the wind. They were angled about 20 degrees off, creating a partial deflection that encouraged draw without creating a direct funnel. The angle mattered as much as the direction. We spent the rest of that morning with Greyhawk adjusting the flaps through various positions while I observed the interior results. He was teaching me to see the relationship between exterior positioning and interior effect, how small changes in flap angle produced dramatic differences in smoke behavior and heat retention. But more than that, he was teaching me to read wind, to feel shifts before they became obvious, to notice the subtle pressure changes that indicated wind direction was changing, to understand that wind wasn't just speed and direction, it had texture and variation that required constant attention. By afternoon, I was making the adjustments myself while Greyhawk observed. He'd nod when I got it right, shake his head when I didn't. No words needed. The smoke inside told the story clearly enough. The second problem with the throat was understanding its relationship to the liner and fire pit. The three elements weren't independent. They formed a system where changing one affected the others. If I restricted the throat opening to retain more heat, I needed to ensure the fire wasn't producing more smoke than the restricted opening could vent. That meant smaller, hotter fires rather than large, smoky ones. If I opened the throat wider to clear smoke, I needed to account for increased heat loss. That meant adding wood to compensate, or accepting a cooler interior temperature. If wind created strong draw that was pulling too much heat out, I needed to either restrict the throat or move my fire position slightly off-center to disrupt the direct updraft. These weren't problems with single solutions. They were variables that required constant balancing based on current conditions. Ketch's early light showed me something I hadn't noticed about their throat management. In the evening, as they prepared for sleep, she would restrict the throat opening significantly, much more than seemed safe for smoke venting. But she'd also bank their fire at the same time, reducing it to hot coals that produced minimal smoke. The restricted throat meant the coal's heat stayed in the living space instead of escaping. The minimal smoke from banked coals could still escape through the smaller opening. The result was a warm teepee through the night without constant feeding of the fire. I tried to replicate this and immediately filled my teepee with smoke. My banking technique was wrong. I was leaving too much unburned wood that produced smoke as it smoldered. I needed to burn wood down more completely before banking, creating a coal bed that radiated heat without creating smoke. This took practice. Burning wood to the right stage required timing and attention. Too early, and you had flames that needed a fully open throat. Too late, and you had dead coals that produced no heat. The window was narrow, hot coals that glowed red but no longer produced flame. Once I learned to bank properly, the evening throat restriction worked as intended. The teepee stayed warm through most of the night. I woke up once around midnight to add a few pieces of wood and adjust the throat back open slightly. Then I'd bank again and sleep until dawn. Greyhawk's morning routine included checking his throat flaps before he even built up his fire. He'd step outside, assess the wind, adjust the flaps accordingly, then go back into work on the fire, knowing the throat was already positioned for current conditions. I adopted this practice. It meant stepping out into cold every morning, but it prevented the cycle of smoke accumulation and emergency adjustments I'd been dealing with. The throat also required physical maintenance I hadn't anticipated. The poles that controlled the flaps needed to be seated properly in the ground outside the teepee. If they worked loose, which they did regularly in freezing and thawing soil, the flaps wouldn't hold their position. Every few days I needed to check the pole stability, reseat them if necessary, and ensure the attachment points between poles and flaps were secure. The rawhide that tied pole to canvas stretched and shrank with temperature changes. Too loose, and the flap sagged. too tight and they tore the canvas. Ice accumulation was another issue. When temperatures dropped below zero and the fire was producing good heat, moisture from inside would vent through the throat opening and freeze on the canvas flaps. After a few days, enough ice would build up to restrict the opening or prevent the flaps from moving properly. I learned to knock ice off the flaps daily, using a long pole to reach up and tap them clean. If I let ice accumulate for too long, it became thick enough to damage the canvas when I finally had to remove it. The throat also taught me about humidity management in ways I hadn't considered. A teepee with a fire burning produced moisture from cooking, from breathing, from wet firewood drying out. That moisture had to escape, or it would condense on the liner and outer walls. The throat opening wasn't just for smoke, it was for moisture, venting. Too restricted and humidity would build up, eventually soaking the liner and reducing its insulation properties. Too open and you vented moisture efficiently, but also vented all your heat. Finding the balance meant paying attention to condensation on the liner. A small amount was normal and acceptable. Heavy condensation that dripped indicated the throat was too restricted or the fire was producing too much moisture. Greyhawk showed me how to adjust firewood selection based on moisture content. Dry, seasoned wood produced less moisture when burning. Green or wet wood produced steam that added to interior humidity. In extreme cold, when keeping the throat restricted was necessary for heat retention, he'd burn only the driest wood to minimize moisture production. I started being more selective about the wood I brought inside. The difference was noticeable. Drier wood meant I could restrict the throat more without humidity becoming a problem. By the third week of November, I'd developed something like competence with the throat management. Not mastery. I still made mistakes, still had mornings when smoke accumulated before I got the positioning right. But I understood the principles well enough to correct errors quickly, rather than suffering through them. The throat had gone from being a feature I barely thought about to being the element I adjusted most frequently, multiple times per day, sometimes multiple times per hour, when wind was variable. This constant attention felt burdensome initially. Why couldn't I just set it and forget it? But I came to understand that the attention was the point. The teepee wasn't a structure you built once and then ignored. It was a living system that required ongoing relationship and response. Greyhawk's teepee worked because he paid attention. Not obsessive attention, but consistent awareness of conditions and willingness to make small adjustments continuously. The throat flaps were the most visible expression of that attention, but the same principle applied to fire management, liner maintenance, wood selection, all of it. You couldn't be lazy about it and expect comfort. You had to show up day after day and tend to the details that kept the system functioning. One afternoon, watching Greyhawk make a small throat adjustment in response to a wind shift I hadn't yet felt, I realized he wasn't thinking about it anymore. His hands moved automatically, adjusting pole position, while his attention stayed on the hide he was working. The knowledge had become embodied, instinctive, the way my hands knew how to plane wood without conscious thought. I wasn't there yet. Every adjustment required conscious decision-making, but I could see the path forward. Eventually, this knowledge would settle into my body the way carpentry had, becoming automatic response rather than deliberate action. The throat taught me that surviving in the mountains wasn't about having perfect knowledge. It was about developing responsive relationship with your environment, about paying attention to small changes and making continuous small adjustments rather than waiting for problems to become crises. The canvas flaps moved in the wind. Smoke rose or pooled. Heat stayed or escaped. And I learned to read those signs and respond over and over until the eye patterns started to feel less like work and more like conversation. The fire pit position seemed like the simplest element of the system. Dig a hole, line it with stones, build fires in it. How much complexity could there be? Considerable, it turned out. Greyhawk had repositioned my fire pit that first day, moved it 8 inches toward the rear of the tipi. At the time, I'd accepted his judgment without fully understanding why it mattered. The explanation about heat rising and needing distance to travel made sense in theory, but I hadn't grasped the practical implications. Those implications became clear 3 weeks later when a sustained cold snap dropped temperatures to 20 below zero for 5 days straight. With the fire pit in its new position, slightly rear of center, the heat pattern in the tipi shifted. The warmest zone was no longer directly around the fire. It was in the center of the living space, where rising heat from the offset fire had to pass through before reaching the smoke hole. This meant the area where I slept, where I sat, where I spent most of my time, received maximum heat exposure. If the pit had remained centered under the smoke hole, that heat would have risen straight up and out. Efficient for the fire, perhaps, but wasteful for warming people. The 8-inch offset seemed minor, but it changed everything about how the space functioned. Greyhawk stopped by during the cold snap and showed me something about coal placement I'd been doing wrong. I'd been spreading coals evenly across the pit bottom, trying to distribute heat uniformly. He demonstrated a different approach, banking coals more heavily on one side, creating zones of higher and lower heat. The hotter zone was for cooking or for quickly warming stones. The cooler zone was for slower, sustained burning of larger wood pieces. This zoned approach required the deeper pit Greyhawk had insisted on. In my original shallow pit, there wasn't enough vertical space to create meaningful temperature differences. The stones themselves taught me about thermal mass in ways I hadn't understood initially. Not all stones perform the same. The dense, heavy ones Greyhawk had selected from the creek bed held heat for hours. Some of the lighter, more porous stones I'd originally used barely retained warmth for 30 minutes after the fire died down. When stones cracked from repeated heating and cooling, which happened regularly, I replaced them with similar dense specimens rather than grabbing whatever was convenient. The size mattered too. Fist-sized stones heated quickly, but cooled quickly. Larger stones, some requiring both hands to move, took longer to heat, but held that heat well into the night. Ketch's early light showed me another aspect of fire pit management I'd been neglecting: ash accumulation. I'd been letting ash build up until it became annoying, then scooping it out all at once. She demonstrated removing ash daily, but not completely, leaving a thin layer at the bottom while removing the excess. The thin ash layer insulated the coals from the ground, helping them retain heat overnight. Too much ash, and it smothered the coals. Too little, and heat conducted into the earth. The right amount, maybe half an inch, improved coal longevity significantly. Greyhawk demonstrated the system's interconnection one afternoon by making deliberate mistakes. He moved his fire pit back to center position, exactly under the smoke hole. His tipi became noticeably colder within an hour, despite the same amount of fire. Heat was escaping too efficiently. He moved the pit too far toward the rear. Smoke began accumulating because the travel distance to the throat was too long. The flow pattern disrupted. He moved it back to the correct position, slightly rear of center, positioned to maximize heat exposure to the living space while maintaining good smoke flow. Temperature and smoke behavior both improved immediately. He was teaching me that the position wasn't arbitrary. It was a specific solution to a specific problem: how to maximize heat delivery to living space while maintaining adequate ventilation. 8 inches off-center wasn't approximate. It was optimal for a TP of this size with this liner configuration. One night, experimenting with coal banking, I managed to maintain comfortable warmth until dawn with only 2 small additions of wood during the night. The stones released stored heat steadily. The deep pit insulated coals from ground cold. The position meant what heat was produced had to pass through living space before escaping. I woke up warm, not just not freezing, actually warm, comfortable, rested in ways I hadn't been since arriving in the mountains. Greyhawk nodded approval when I told him about the successful night. He said something in Shoshone that I was beginning to understand better. Not the specific words, but the meaning. Something about fire being a partner rather than a tool. About working with it instead of forcing it, not just a hole in the ground. A carefully designed element that made survival possible through knowledge earned over generations of cold winters. I thought I'd understood the system after 3 weeks, understood it well enough to start modifying it, improving it, making it my own, rather than just copying Greyhawk's example. I was wrong. The first mistake was thinking I could skip the daily liner maintenance. It seemed excessive, taking down the liner, airing it out, reinstalling it, all for what looked like minimal moisture accumulation. I could save an hour by letting it go longer between maintenance cycles. I let it go a week, then 2 weeks. The liner seemed fine. No obvious problems. By week 3, I noticed the teepee wasn't staying as warm. Greyhawk noticed the smoke pattern from my teepee had changed, more frequent, indicating more active burning. He stopped by and immediately went to examine my liner. He lifted the edge and showed me what I'd been ignoring. Moisture. Not visible as drips, but present in the hide, making it heavy and slightly stiff. The accumulated moisture was reducing the liner's insulation properties. It was also adding weight that caused the liner to sag in places, disrupting the air gap between liner and outer wall. We took down the liner. It took longer than usual because the moisture-heavy hide was harder to handle. While it dried, I sat in my teepee without the liner and remembered exactly how cold that felt. Within an hour, frost formed on the inside of the canvas. The liner went back up that evening. The difference was immediate. But I'd wasted a day fixing a problem I'd created by thinking I knew better than the maintenance schedule Greyhawk had demonstrated. The second mistake was more complex. I'd been adjusting the throat flaps the way Greyhawk had taught me, but I started trying to optimize beyond what he'd shown me. I found a throat position that seemed to retain heat even better than his method, with the flaps angled to restrict the opening more than he typically did. For 2 days, it worked beautifully. The teepee stayed warmer. Wood consumption dropped. On the 3rd day, I woke up to smoke pooled at eye level, thick enough to make breathing difficult. The restricted throat opening wasn't providing adequate ventilation. I stumbled outside, coughing, adjusted the flaps to clear the smoke. The temperature had dropped significantly. The sudden increase in ventilation had pulled heat out along with smoke. The balance Greyhawk had shown me wasn't arbitrary. It was the point where smoke vented adequately while heat was retained as much as possible. My optimization had pushed past that balance point into dysfunction. The third mistake nearly killed me. I'd been managing the fire pit well for several weeks, good coal banking, proper ash removal, attentive stone maintenance. But I got careless about stone selection when replacing a cracked stone. The replacement I grabbed looked similar to the others, dense, heavy, dark-colored. I placed it in the fire pit, built up the evening fire around it, and went to sleep. Woke sometime around midnight to a sound like a gunshot. The stone had exploded. Fragments had blown outward with enough force to embed in the liner. One piece had landed on my sleeping robe, still hot, burning a hole before I could brush it away. I'd selected a river stone. The dense appearance had fooled me, but river stones often have water trapped in their structure. Heating drives that water to steam. Steam creates pressure. Pressure finds the weakest point in the stone and explodes outward. Greyhawk had selected stones from specific locations in the creek bed for exactly this reason. From exposed banks where stones had been dry for years, not from the active creek where water could permeate them. I'd forgotten this detail or hadn't fully appreciated its importance and nearly burned down my teepee or worse. The fourth mistake was subtler and took weeks to recognize. I'd been positioning the fire pit where Greyhawk had shown me, 8 inches rear of center. But my teepee was slightly different in size than his. Mine was 12 feet in diameter. His was closer to 14. The same offset that worked for his larger teepee created too much smoke travel distance in my smaller one. Smoke would linger slightly longer than optimal before exiting, creating a constant low-level haze that irritated my throat and eyes. Greyhawk spent an evening in my teepee and noticed the smoke pattern. He measured the distances involved, did some mental calculation I couldn't follow, and had me move the pit forward. Not back to center, but only 6 inches rear of center instead of 8. The smoke behavior improved immediately. The principle he'd taught me was correct: offset the fire pit toward the rear. But the specific measurement had to scale with teepee size. I'd copied his measurement without accounting for the size difference. Each of these mistakes taught through consequence: cold when the liner sagged, smoke when the throat was positioned wrong, danger when the stone exploded, irritation when the pit position was slightly off. I'd been impatient to master the system, eager to move past the learning phase and into competent execution. That impatience had led me to skip maintenance, modify without understanding, copy without adapting. By December, I'd made most of the obvious mistakes and learned from them. The learning hurt: wasted time, wasted wood, discomfort, occasional danger. But each mistake clarified some aspect of why the system was designed the way it was. The liner maintenance schedule wasn't excessive. It was necessary. The throat positioning wasn't approximate. It was precise. The stone selection criteria weren't optional preferences. They were safety requirements. The fire pit offset wasn't a general principle. It was a specific calculation based on teepee dimensions. I'd arrived in the mountains thinking I was competent to survive. I'd built structures before. I understood basic construction. How hard could living in a teepee be? Hard. Enough that without Greyhawk's teaching, I probably would have frozen before spring. Hard enough that knowledge wasn't enough. I needed practice, mistakes, correction, and repeated application before the knowledge settled into functional skill. The system Greyhawk had taught me wasn't a set of instructions to follow once and forget. It was a practice to maintain continuously, a relationship to sustain through attention and care. But I was learning, one mistake at a time, one correction at a time, one cold night revealing one overlooked detail at a time. January 12th, 1848. The temperature started dropping at sunset. Not the usual gradual cooling, but a rapid plunge that made the air itself feel different, brittle, sharp, like breathing through shattered glass. By full dark, my breath was freezing before it fully left my mouth. The canvas walls of the teepee made cracking sounds as they contracted in the cold. Outside, trees were popping from the freeze, sharp reports that echoed across the valley like distant gunfire. I'd learned to read the signs of extreme cold coming, the way the sky cleared to absolute transparency, the way sound carried differently, the way the Shoshone families spent extra time preparing their lodges, bringing in additional wood, checking their liners, adjusting throat flaps in anticipation of conditions that hadn't arrived yet, but were coming. I'd spent the afternoon following their example. Extra wood stacked inside, dry and ready. Liner checked for any sagging or moisture. Fire pit coals banked with more care than usual, ensuring a hot bed that would last. Stones positioned to maximize radiation. Throat flaps adjusted precisely, balanced between ventilation and heat retention. Everything I'd learned over the past 3 months went into that preparation. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. Wind hit 30 miles an hour, steady and brutal. The kind of wind that found every weakness in a structure, every gap, every thin point. I lay in my sleeping robes, feeling the robes themselves starting to stiffen from cold at their outer edges, and listened to the wind try to find entry. The liner held. Cold air was entering. I could feel it flowing in the gap at the bottom of the liner, channeling into the space between walls. But instead of pouring across the floor where I slept, it was rising between the walls, warming slightly from contact with the heated liner and entering the living space at head height where its bite was dulled. The fire pit radiated steadily. I'd banked it 3 hours earlier, covering hot coals with a careful layer of ash, positioning a few large pieces of wood to catch slowly. The flames were minimal, just small licks occasionally visible, but heat continued pouring off the stones. I could hold my hand 6 inches above the stone ring and feel warmth strong enough to be uncomfortable. That heat was radiating outward in all directions, warming the air in the lower portion of the teepee where cold air wanted to settle. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to add wood. Not because the teepee had become cold, but because the coal bed was low enough that I wanted to maintain it through the remainder of the night. I added 3 pieces of wood, positioned to catch from the coals without creating excessive flame. Adjusted the throat flap slightly to account for a shift in wind direction. Checked the liner, no sagging, no excess moisture. Went back to sleep. The entire process took maybe 5 minutes. I didn't need to build up a fire from scratch. Didn't need to warm a space that had gone cold. Just maintained a system that was already working. When I woke at dawn, the teepee was cool but not cold. My breath was visible but not freezing immediately. The sleeping robes were still pliable. My feet weren't numb. Outside, the temperature was still 15 below zero. Inside, the system had maintained livable conditions through the worst night of the winter so far. Greyhawk emerged from his teepee an hour after dawn. He looked over at mine, noted the smoke pattern, nodded. His face didn't show surprise or approval, just acknowledgement that the system had worked as designed. That was the moment I understood I'd crossed some threshold. Not mastery, I was far from that, but competence. The ability to maintain the system under extreme conditions, to make the adjustments and preparations that allowed survival rather than just endurance. The temperature stayed below zero for 5 more days. Each night I went through the same preparation routine. Each morning I woke to a space that was livable rather than lethal. Some of the white trappers in the valley weren't as fortunate. Word came through the Shoshone camp that 2 men had abandoned their shelters and tried to make it to Fort Bridger. They'd frozen to death about 10 miles out. Another trapper had survived but lost 3 toes to frostbite. These weren't stupid men. They weren't unprepared in the usual sense. They'd had shelter, firewood, provisions, but they'd had incomplete knowledge, canvas and poles without liners, fire pits without thermal mass, throat flaps they didn't know how to manage, adequate shelter for moderate winters, lethal shelter for extreme cold. Greyhawk's gift hadn't been just the physical elements, liner, stones, positioning. It had been the understanding of why those elements mattered, the knowledge of how cold actually behaved, how heat actually moved, how air actually flowed. That knowledge was the difference between the trappers who died and me waking up to make coffee in a space that had held livable temperature through 20 below cold. Greyhawk stopped by that afternoon. He said something in Shoshone I'd started to understand better after 3 months of listening. Something about winter testing men, about preparation mattering more than strength, about knowledge being the difference between life and death. Then he added in English, "You live now, before you survive. Different things." He was right. For the first 3 weeks in the mountains I'd been surviving, barely maintaining existence through desperate effort. Now I was living, still working, still tending the fire and adjusting the throat and maintaining the liner, but doing it from a position of knowledge rather than panic. The system wasn't magic. It was physics. Heat rising, cold sinking, air flowing, materials behaving according to their properties. But understanding those physics, knowing how to work with them rather than against them, that was knowledge worth having. Knowledge that had saved my life through the coldest stretch of the winter. By February, I was using half the firewood I'd burned in October. Same cold, same wind, same mountain winter. But the system had changed how efficiently fire translated into warmth. The Shoshone families no longer watched me with concern when I emerged each morning. I'd become just another presence in the valley, someone who'd learned to live in the mountains rather than simply occupy space in them. Greyhawk and I had developed a routine of sorts. Not friendship, exactly. The language barrier and cultural distance prevented that depth of connection. But something like mutual respect. He'd nod when he passed my teepee and saw the smoke pattern indicating proper fire management. I'd nod back, acknowledgement that I'd learned what he'd taught. Their teaching hadn't been just those first few days of direct instruction. It had been ongoing through observation and small corrections and demonstrations by example. I'd absorbed knowledge that couldn't be conveyed through words alone. How to read smoke patterns to understand airflow. How to feel slight changes in wind pressure that indicated shifts in direction. How to gauge coal temperature by sound and color rather than touch. This was the knowledge that couldn't be sold at Fort Bridger, couldn't be written in a guidebook, couldn't be learned without time and attention and willingness to observe carefully. In late February, a trapper I'd met briefly at Fort Bridger arrived in the valley. His name was William, and he'd been in the mountains 2 years longer than me. He stopped by one afternoon. When he entered my teepee, his reaction was immediate and visible. "How in hell are you keeping it this warm?" he asked. I explained about the liner, about the fire pit position and depth, about the throat management, about the thermal mass in the stones. He listened, but I could see the resistance building. Not disbelief exactly, more like the stubborn pride I'd felt before cold had broken it. The sense that he should be able to figure this out himself without needing help, especially help from Indians he barely acknowledged as people. I offered to help him add a liner to his teepee. He declined, said he'd manage fine, had survived 2 winters already without any fancy additions. 3 weeks later, word came through the Shoshone camp that William had abandoned his camp and headed for lower elevation. Too cold, burning too much wood, couldn't sustain the effort required to stay alive in an inadequate structure. He survived, but he left the mountains, gave up on trapping because the winter had broken something in him, not his body, but his will to endure. Greyhawk heard about this and said something to me in Shoshone. I didn't catch all of it, but the meaning was clear enough. Pride cost more than cold does. He was right. My pride had cost me a month of suffering before I accepted help. William's pride had cost him his livelihood in the mountains. The knowledge Greyhawk had shared wasn't just about physical survival, it was about understanding that some things couldn't be learned alone, that accepting teaching wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. March brought the first real warmth. Snow started melting off south-facing slopes. The Shoshone families began preparing for spring movement, breaking down winter camps, preparing to move to summer hunting grounds. Greyhawk and Catch's Early Light would be leaving. I'd probably never see them again. The day before they departed, Greyhawk walked over to my teepee one last time. He checked the liner with the same critical eye Catch's Early Light had always used, looked at the fire pit, the throat flaps, the general state of maintenance. Finally, he nodded, said something in Shoshone that sounded like approval. Then he pointed to me, to the teepee, and made a gesture that encompassed the whole system. Said in English, "You know now, this is yours." Not the physical structure, the knowledge. He was releasing me from the apprentice role, acknowledging that I'd learned enough to continue without oversight. I tried to thank him. The words felt inadequate. How do you thank someone for saving your life through teaching? For sharing knowledge your culture developed over generations with someone from the culture displacing yours? He waved off the thanks, said something else in Shoshone, then added in English, "Cold kills white men every winter. Tired of finding bodies." That was his explanation for why he'd helped. Not generosity exactly, not friendship, just pragmatic acknowledgement that knowledge prevented death, and preventing death was better than finding bodies in spring. I chose to hear the kindness beneath the pragmatic framing. They left the next morning, the whole camp moving out in a coordinated procession that spoke of countless generations doing the same thing at the same time of year. Greyhawk raised his hand in farewell as they passed. I raised mine back. Then they were gone, and I was alone in the valley with my teepee and my knowledge and the rest of winter to survive until the passes cleared and I could make it to Fort Bridger. I'd arrived in the mountains in August thinking I was prepared. Canvas, poles, firewood, provisions, everything the trader said I'd need. I'd been wrong in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The gap between having shelter and knowing how to live in it had almost killed me. Greyhawk and Ketch's early light had bridged that gap, had taught me that survival in the mountains required more than materials. It required relationship with those materials, understanding how they behaved, attention to how systems functioned, willingness to maintain and adjust and respond. The liner hung straight and dry. The fire pit radiated steady warmth. The throat flaps drew smoke efficiently. The system worked because I'd learned to work with it, because someone had cared enough to teach, because knowledge had been shared across cultural boundaries by people who had every reason to let me freeze. I fed the fire one more time that night, banked it carefully, adjusted the throat flaps, checked the liner. Outside, the temperature dropped toward zero. Inside, warmth held. The difference between those two states was knowledge. Hard-won, carefully taught, gratefully learned knowledge that had made survival possible. I'd carry that knowledge forward, use it well, respect what it represented, and hope that someday I'd have the opportunity to share it the way it had been shared with me, freely, patiently, with the understanding that knowledge was too valuable to hoard and too important to let die. The fire glowed in the darkness, the liner breathed, the stones held heat. And I survived the winter, not through strength or cleverness or superior preparation, but through the generosity of people who'd taught me what survival in the mountains actually required. That's what warmth costs. Not just wood and effort, but humility to learn, patience to practice, and gratitude to those who teach.